The Illusion of Nothingness, Pillar 2, 3. Chapter 3. The Illusion of Nothingness, Pillar 2, 3.1. Oh, you defined it. Then it's something. One of the oldest philosophical riddles asks, why is there something rather than nothing? This question assumes that nothingness is a legitimate possibility, a state that reality could have been. In this chapter, we dismantle that assumption. We will show that nothing is not an ontological alternative at all, but a conceptual placeholder, a linguistic sleight of hand and cognitive mistake. There never was, and never could be, a state of absolute nothingness. Existence is all there is, all there ever was, and all there ever could be. To see why, we must examine the roots of the nothing concept in language and mind, the psychological sources of our fascination with nothingness, especially in fears of death and in negation, the lessons of modern physics about empty space, and the logical paradoxes that arise when we try to treat nothing as real. By the end, nothingness will be unmasked as an illusion that has subtly pervaded theology and science, but one that cannot withstand rigorous scrutiny. 3.2. The Illusion of Nothingness. Language seduces us into believing in nothing as if it were something. We use the word nothing as a noun, the subject of sentences, which tricks us into thinking it references an entity. For example, when someone says there is nothing in the box, the grammar suggests nothing is in the box, as if nothing were a mysterious occupant. In reality, the sentence means no thing is in the box. The word nothing here doesn't name a thing at all. It indicates an absence. Yet by functioning as a grammatically countable noun, nothing creates a mirage of existence. This linguistic quirk was noted in philosophical analysis. An article about nothing can mean either an article about no thing, no particular subject, or an article about nothing, treating nothing as a subject in its own right. The latter reading is misleading. It reifies an absence into an object. Our habit of turning nothing into a noun leads to contradictions if taken literally. To even speak of nothingness is to make it into something in thought or language. Philosophers have long warned of this trap. Parmenides, in the 5th century BCE, argued that non-existence cannot be meaningfully spoken or thought of. Thou canst not recognize not being, nor couldst thou speak of it, for thought and being are the same thing. Parmenides 1984, in other words, to think at all is to think of something, to speak of nothing, as if it were something is to deny the very meaning of nothingness. To predicate anything of nothingness, to call it vast, empty, ineffable, or any other attribute, is immediately self-contradictory, since nothingness, by definition, has no qualities without turning into a kind of something. Much philosophical mischief arises from failing to notice this linguistic sleight of hand. The word nothing is a useful convenience in grammar. It allows us to talk about absences succinctly, but when we take the word too seriously, we end up imagining an actual condition called nothingness. In truth, nothing is not a thing, and treating it as one is a mistake of language. As Victor Hugo memorably wrote, there is no such thing as nothingness. Nothing is nothing, Hugo. 1862, he was poetically making the same point. Nihilism, the belief in an ontological nothing, has no substance. We will see this more clearly by looking at how our minds handle absence and negation. 3.3. Cognitive roots. Absence as a thing. Why do we even conceive of nothing in the first place? Part of the answer lies in our cognitive and perceptual experience of absence. Human minds evolved to navigate a world of things, but they also had to register when something sought is not there. We have experiences of nothing in a pragmatic sense, for instance, when you reach into your pocket, expecting your keys and find nothing, or when a loved one dies and you feel the absence of their presence. Such experiences are real, but notice what they truly are. Experiences of expectation unfulfilled, or of something once present, no longer present. The absence is always defined relative to an anticipated presence. You expected keys, but there were none. You once had your loved one alive, now you do not. The feeling of nothing is actually the feeling of loss or lack against a background of somethingness. Cognitive science shows that recognizing an absence is a sophisticated feat of the mind. A striking example is the development of object permanence in infants. In the first few months of life, babies behave as if things that disappear from view have ceased to exist. Out of sight, out of existence describes their world. If you hide a toy, a very young infant will not search for it. To their undeveloped mind, it's simply gone. In psychologist Jean Piaget's classic findings, Piaget 1954, it's only around 812 months of age that infants grasp that unseen objects still exist. Before this cognitive milestone, the infant's world blinked out anything not currently sensed, a naive form of treating absence as total non-being. As object permanence solidifies, the child learns that reality doesn't evaporate when not observed. Once it overcomes that, the child no longer thinks the toy has become nothing. They understand it's just hidden. In effect, we are all born with a fleeting illusion of nothingness, assuming unseen equal to non-existent, that we quickly outgrow. Even as adults, our brains can be fooled by absences. We perceive holes, shadows, and silences, and often treat them as if they were positive entities. A hole in a donut appears to be a distinct thing. We can point to it, measure it. Yet a hole is not an independent object, only an absence of dough. Philosophers note that holes are ontologically parasitic. They only exist in something else, and cannot exist in isolation. You cannot have a hole without a surrounding donut or ground or medium. A world consisting solely of holes is impossible. The same is true of shadows, absence of light or silence, absence of sound. We talk about these absences as if they had their own being. The silence was deafening, a dark shadow moved, but these phrases are convenient fictions of language and perception. The shadow moves only because an object blocking light moved. The silence deafens only in contrast to expected noise. In reality, a shadow is just where light isn't, and a silence is where sound isn't. Yet our minds assign a kind of ghostly substance to these negations, a cognitive quirk that can be called an absence's entity bias. This bias extends to abstract thinking. Consider the concept of zero in mathematics, a symbol for nothingness countable as a number. The invention of zero was revolutionary, precisely because it allowed us to treat none as a number, manipulating it like a something. Yet zero's status was philosophically and psychologically perplexing. Ancient cultures struggled with it. The Greeks and Romans, for example, had no numeral for zero. Medieval Europeans were suspicious of the concept when it arrived from Arabic mathematics. The Italian city of Florence even banned zero for a time in the 13th century, as it was thought to invite fraudulent bookkeeping. Why such resistance? Perhaps because zero, nothing challenged the comfortable notion that numbers count things. How can no thing be a number? Eventually, zero was accepted as an abstract placeholder, not because nothingness had become more real, but because we recognized the utility of marking an absence quantitatively. Even today, understanding zero has a cognitive cost. Studies in numerical cognition suggest that thinking about none piggybacks on our ability to perceive absence in sets. In short, our brains can represent nothing in a variety of contexts, whether seeing a missing object, sensing a gap, or using the number zero. But in each case, this representation is parasitic on something else, an expected object, a surrounding context, or a counting framework. The mind never truly grasps nothing on its own terms. It always smuggles in a background of somethingness, against which the nothing is defined. This insight hints that nothingness is not a fundamental intuition, but a derivative notion. We derive it by mentally taking something and removing it, then contemplating the leftover void. But the void is never truly void. It inherits meaning from whatever was removed. Try for a moment a simple exercise. Imagine absolute nothingness. Try to picture in your mind the total absence of being. No world, no self, no space or time, utter non-existence. What do you experience? Most likely you still experience something. Perhaps a black emptiness, a blank expanse, or a sense of floating in a dark space. But blackness is a color, or the presence of unperceived light. Emptiness is still a spatial idea. A blank is still a concept. The human brain cannot present to consciousness an image of pure nothingness. There's no content to present. Even the attempt to imagine nothing tends to produce something, however vague or abstract. This psychological fact underscores Parmenides' ancient point: you can't truly think nothing. The moment you try, it becomes something in your mind, even if just a conceptual negation. Thus, from both developmental evidence and introspective truth, what we call nothing is a mental shadow cast by something, a shadow that we can mistakenly treat as substantial if we're not careful. 3.4 Death, negation, and the illusion of the void. Our conceptual error of treating absence as entity is compounded by emotional and existential factors. Foremost among these is death. Human beings uniquely understand their own mortality, and many traditions describe death as a passage into nothingness, the end of one's existence or experience. This idea can be terrifying. One imagines falling into a void of non-being, a null state where the self is annihilated. The fear of being nothing or of nothingness after death has haunted minds for millennia. But here, we must carefully distinguish reality from imagination. What is it actually like to experience nothingness? The honest answer is, it's not like anything at all, because when you are nothing, you aren't there to experience it. This is the insight of the Epicurean tradition in ancient philosophy. As Epicurus famously wrote, death is nothing to us. When we exist, death is not. And when death exists, we are not. Epicurus ND, we never actually encounter our own non-existence. There is no point at which a person perceives, I am now no more. The state of not existing is not a state for the person who died. It's only a notion for those still alive, observing that the person is gone. The person themselves simply isn't, and thus cannot suffer or lament the nothingness of death. Yet our imaginations betray us. We project ourselves into a post-mortem void and shudder, as if we would be trapped in a black abyss for eternity. This is a powerful illusion, a kind of mental self-contradiction where we conceive of being there to witness our own absence. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein pointed out a related fallacy. Death is not an event in life. We do not live to experience death. Wittgenstein, 1922. The end of consciousness is never part of one's conscious content. Thus, nothingness in the personal existential sense is never actually experienced. It's inferred and feared as an unknown. Our fear treats it as a something, a dark blank where we imagine being dead. But this is as illusory as imagining what it was like before we were born. We might picture a void or darkness before our birth, but who was there to witness that? No one. It's a non-situation. We are not the first to notice this. Two very different voices have made the same point from different angles. Mark Twain is often credited with the observation that he had been dead for billions of years before he was born, and never found it the least bit troubling. Twain. N.D. While Christopher Hitchens offered an insight about why we actually have fear in death, in a darker register, compares death to leaving the party, and being told that the party will go on, only now without you. Hitchens. But the important note is that once you are gone, there is no knowledge of the party, thus no way to miss it. Both remarks underline the same structural fact we have been hammering on. There is no lived state of being nothing. There is experience, and then there is the absence of a subject to experience anything. The nightmare image of being trapped in a vast, positive nothing, and also longing for existence, is a story we tell ourselves, not a real condition anyone is ever in. Negation in general tends to create these cognitive illusions. Consider how when we use negation in language is not nothing, nowhere, our minds often momentarily invoke the thing denied. If we say unicorns do not exist, we must first have an idea of a unicorn to negate. If someone says I feel nothing, they're implicitly referencing feelings they could have had. Every negation is conceptually tethered to a positive content. This is why absent and negative concepts can feel real to us. We can't say nothing is here without imagining the here and what it means for it to be empty. In logic, nothing exists is just a shorthand for all X. X does not exist, a sweeping negation of any entity, but notice that logic cannot have a constant or object named nothing without running into contradictions. Properly speaking, nothing is an operator on other concepts denying their existence, not an object itself. These observations reinforce that nothingness is always parasitic on somethingness. We come up with the idea of nothing by taking a bit of reality and mentally nullifying it. The zero and the void are like whole concepts in our mental fabric, defined by surrounding somethings. No wonder then that absolute nothingness, conceived as a standalone reality, slips through our fingers. It is a concept that always points to something else, the thing that isn't there, never to itself. The illusion of the void, that there could be, even theoretically, nothing, owes much to our fears and acts of negation. We dread being nothing, or we speak of nothingness in grand terms, but these are ultimately fantasies born of language and emotion. They do not denote an actual ontological possibility. 3.5 Physics and the absence of nothing. For a long time, humans wondered whether empty space, a total vacuum, is possible in nature. Aristotle argued that a true void cannot exist. Nature abhors a vacuum, believing that emptiness would undermine the coherence of the physical world. Aristotle, 1999. Later scientists proved we can have vacuums in the practical sense, for example, suction pumps removing air from a chamber. By the 17th century, the existence of void space between particles or celestial bodies became an accepted part of physics. It might have seemed that nothingness had a place. The empty vacuum between stars, or the inside of an evacuated bell jar, could be thought of as tiny pockets of nothing. However, as physics has advanced, even the vacuum has dissolved into something. Modern quantum theory reveals that what we call empty space is teeming with activity and structure. Even if you remove all matter, all particles, and all radiation from a region, it still isn't nothing. Quantum fields permeate every inch of space, and they can never be completely switched off. The vacuum state in quantum field theory is not an empty box, but a field configuration, the lowest energy state of something. It has fluctuations. Particles can momentarily flicker into existence as virtual pairs. Energy fields can oscillate. Experiments have demonstrated tangible effects of vacuum energy, such as the Casimir effect, where two close metal plates experience an attractive force because certain vacuum field modes are excluded between them. To put it simply, the vacuum has energy, and energy, as Albert Einstein showed, is equivalent to mass, E equal to mc2, Einstein. 1920. So an energetic vacuum is far from nothing. It is a real physical entity with measurable properties. As one analysis puts it, if vacuum have energy that can produce particles, then calling a vacuum empty is a misnomer. To say a vacuum has energy denies that it is truly empty. Unsurprisingly, many physicists revel in the idea that the vacuum is far from empty. This modern understanding has led some scientists to claim that physics has answered the question, why is there something rather than nothing? By showing how nothingness is unstable, how quantum nothing inevitably produces something. Notably, physicist Lawrence Krauss titled his book A Universe from Nothing, Krauss 2012, and argued that given quantum laws, universes can spontaneously pop into being from empty space. Stephen Hawking likewise argued that given the law of gravity, the universe could create itself from nothing. Hawking and Mlodinow 2010, but we must examine these claims carefully. What do they mean by nothing? In truth, these physicists are not describing a state of absolute non-existence. They are describing the quantum vacuum, or a similar foundational physical law, and calling that nothing. Philosophers were quick to point out that this is a bait and switch. The nothing of Lawrence Krauss or Stephen Hawking is actually a something, a rich, law-governed structure, ripe with potentiality. As the philosopher David Z. Albert famously critiqued, relativistic quantum field theoretical vacuum states, no less than giraffes or refrigerators or solar systems, are particular arrangements of elementary physical stuff. None of these poppings of particles in the vacuum amount to anything even remotely in the neighborhood of a creation from nothing. Albert. 2012, in other words, calling the quantum vacuum nothing is like calling a fist nothing but moving fingers. It misses the point that the fingers' fields are themselves something. The only true nothing in physics would be the absence of all fields, all laws, all potential, a state with no space, time, matter, or energy whatsoever. And physics does not deal with such a state, because there's no evidence it ever existed or could exist. It's literally not a state that any physical theory can capture, since physics, by definition, describes something the way energy and matter behave. Cosmology, when tracing the origin of the universe, often talks about the universe emerging from an extremely hot, dense point, the Big Bang. Does it say it came from nothing? The honest answer is that standard Big Bang cosmology stops at the first fraction of a second. It describes how the early universe expanded and cooled, but it doesn't tell us what, if anything, preceded that or what caused it. Some theoretical models speculate about a quantum fluctuation triggering the Big Bang, or a tunneling from a prior state. But again, those models presuppose a quantum state or prior cosmos of some sort, not absolute nothingness. The phrase universe from nothing in popular science is usually shorthand for universe from a vacuum governed by physics, which, as we've established, is not truly nothing. As a result, modern physics actually reinforces the idea that something is fundamental. Even a vacuum is a sea of fields. Even a void has space-time structure. The old image of empty space as literally nothingness has vanished. Ironically, Aristotle's intuition that nature abhors a vacuum seems true at the deepest level. There is no complete void, only a plenum of fields and possibilities. Every experiment and observation we have ever made has always found something, if not matter, then energy, if not energy, at least space and time, if not even space-time, which we've never observed absent, at least the presence of logical laws or mathematical structure. No observation has ever produced a true nothing, nor could it, for if nothing were observed, there'd be no observer or observation. The very act of observing requires that something exists, an observer, a detector, etc. So empirically nothing is a hypothesis we can never confirm. Reality gives us no reason to think that absolute nothingness is even a coherent option. 3.6. The paradox of nothingness, ontological parasites. We have approached nothingness from language, mind, and physics, and everywhere we find it to be a will-o'-the-wisp. Now we can summarize the logical paradoxes that arise when people try to treat nothing as real. First and foremost, to define nothing is to refute it. The moment we say nothing is such and such, we've implicitly made it into a something with properties, undermining its own definition. If you say nothing exists, you assert that there is a state of affairs, the existence of nothing. But that very statement contradicts itself, since the state of affairs would be something. It's akin to the liar paradox of ontology. The only way nothing exists could be true is if it's not true, because if it is true, then something, the truth of that statement, exists. A world in which nothing is true cannot include the truth of that very claim. Likewise, a reality of absolute nothingness cannot include the fact of its own nothingness. In this sense, nothingness as a total state is logically incoherent. There is no internally consistent way to posit absolute non-being. This aligns with a venerable principle often phrased in Latin, ex nihilo nihil fit. From nothing, nothing comes. Philosophers and theologians throughout history have invoked this axiom to say that you cannot get something out of nothing without remainder. If there were ever truly nothing, it would still be nothing now, since nothingness has no potential, no hidden gears that could start turning to generate existence. The fact that something exists, indeed a whole universe of somethings, implies that an absolute void was never the case. Parmenides drilled this point home over 2,000 years ago, for never shall this be proved, that the things that are not are. Non-existence cannot actually be, only being is. He concluded that being is eternal and ungenerated because nothing can neither give rise to nor even be meaningfully thought of as a real state. In plainer terms, there simply is no alternative to existence. Nothingness isn't a viable counter-state. It's a pseudo-idea we get by, imagining the subtraction of all specific things. But it is not itself a concrete reality. Even the question, why is there something rather than nothing, might be logically improper. We can certainly rephrase it as why does this particular universe exist and not no universe at all? Which sounds sensible, yet if no universe at all is an impossibility, the question answers itself. There is something because nothing was never possible. Some philosophers have suggested exactly that. For instance, one rejoinder to the famous question is, why not? Why shouldn't there be something? After all, if truly nothing existed, there'd be no laws, no logic, no constraint to prevent something from existing, but also no mechanism to allow it. The question often sneaks in a sense that nothingness is the natural default, and something the oddity needing explanation. But if nothingness is self-defeating, then existence is the only option, and the demand to explain existence over nothing is like asking, but why aren't 2 and 2 making 5 instead of 4? It presumes a false counterfactual. As the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy notes, some thinkers argue we should start where we are, with existence, rather than assume an empty world as a default, because if we start from absolutely nothing, we lack the bearings needed to navigate forward. Sorensen, 2008. Trying to begin an explanation from nothing is like trying to build a house on an absence. You can't get started. In fact, any explanation or reason we give is itself something, a thought, a law, a cause. So explanation inherently belongs to the realm of existence. Asking for an explanation of existence in terms of non-existence is a fundamentally ill-posed request. There is also a statistical or metaphysical argument some have made that nothing is just one possibility among infinitely many something possibilities, and thus it's actually more likely that something exists. Imagine all the different ways reality could be, countless types of universes or sets of laws. Among these, absolutely nothing is presumably only one unique case, and arguably not even a valid case. So if one were randomly picking a reality, the odds of hitting exactly the nothingness state are essentially zero. This tongue-in-cheek argument, nurtured by philosopher Peter van Inwagen and Lowe, 1996, flips the intuition that nothing is simpler. Sure, the description "nothing exists" is a short phrase, but the reality of something is robust and self-sustaining, whereas nothing cannot actualize itself. Ultimately, whether through logic or through probability, we come to see that nothingness cannot stand on its own feet. It is either internally contradictory or at best an empty description with no explanatory power. 3.7 Theological and Scientific Myths of Nothingness. The illusion of nothingness has also crept into theological and scientific storytelling, where it can cause confusion. In some religious narratives, especially within classical theism, it is said that God created the world ex nihilo, out of nothing. This has often been misunderstood to imply that at some primordial moment there was only nothingness, and then God somehow conjured existence into being. Critics pounce on this. How can something come from nothing? But here it's important to pass the intended meaning. The theological doctrine of creatio ex nihilo was historically meant to deny that God fashioned the world out of some pre-existing material or primordial chaos. It wasn't asserting that nothing was a state that preceded creation, rather. It says God's creative act didn't use any prior stuff. If one takes it incorrectly as once there was only nothing, and then the universe appeared, one faces the problems we have outlined. Indeed, so do theologians. They would have to answer how even God could operate on absolute non-being. Most theologians avoid this by contending that God is eternal, so there was never a state where literally nothing at all existed. God at least was there. Or by saying that time itself began with creation. So it's meaningless to talk of before creation when nothing was. In effect, a careful theist does not truly affirm a state of absolute nothingness. They always have God or God's power as the something that brings forth other things. Thus, when properly understood, creation from nothing still posits existence, divine, before physical existence. The nothing is not an ontological reality. It's the absence of material precedent. If, on the other hand, someone were to insist that absolutely nothing, no God, no laws, truly nada, existed, and then the universe popped out, that person would be asserting an absurdity that no classical theology defends. It would be far more damning to the idea of God, because it would eliminate even God from the equation and violate ex nihilo nihil fit. In scientific cosmology, similar care is needed. Phrases like the universe came from nothing make for provocative headlines, but as we discussed, they rely on redefining nothing. When physicist Stephen Hawking said because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing, he smuggled in the law of gravity as a precondition. Remove that law, remove the entire framework of physics, and his statement would have nothing to latch onto. A law of nature is not nothing. It's a regularity or rule that is part of the furniture of existence. In fact, Stephen Hawking's statement unintentionally underscores our thesis. Given something, a law of gravity, something, a universe, can arise. But he never truly dealt with the case of no law, no space, no time at all, nor could he, since that's outside the scope of science. Likewise, cosmologist Alexander Vilenkin has spoken of the universe, tunneling into existence from nothing, but upon inspection, this nothing is a quantum vacuum of some sort, governed by a metastable potential. Vilenkin, 1982. It's not the absolute void of non-being. These scientific models, fascinating as they are, ultimately do not escape the circle of existence. They merely push the question one level back to why is there a law or a vacuum rather than nothing? A question which remains either philosophical or meaningless. The key point is, whether in theology or cosmology, whenever nothingness is invoked as a starting point, it either is not truly nothing, something else is actually there under another name, or it is an error. Every creation story needs a seed. In religious terms, that seed is God's will or word. In scientific terms, that seed might be a quantum fluctuation or a prior state. But a seed cannot come from zero seeds. The urge to say first there was nothing, then something is usually a storytelling device to highlight the marvel of creation, not a literal ontological description. We must be careful not to let poetry or metaphor trick us into imagining that nothing had some kind of being. Even those inclined to believe in a divine creation can agree that at least one thing, God, must be eternal. Hence, reality never bottomed out to nullity. And those who prefer a secular view might posit an eternal multiverse, or self-caused universe, again meaning there was always something. In either case, the total void is avoided because it cannot produce anything. 3.8 Conclusion: Existence undefeated. We began with the suspicion that nothingness might be an illusion, and we have traversed a landscape of arguments and evidence to confirm it. Nothingness fails as a concept on every count, linguistically, cognitively, physically, and logically. It is not a genuine ontological state, but a shadow cast by our language and imagination when we consider the absence of particular things. Like a mirage, it disappears upon close inspection. There is always some substrate, some context, some observer, or concept that unmasks nothing as in fact something. We find that whenever we think we found nothing, we have only found a gap between things, or a placeholder in a system of somethings. This conclusion has profound implications. It means that existence is the only reality. Being is an absolute that has no negation. In other chapters, we arrive at a similar insight from different angles. In the epistemic refutation paradox, we discovered a foundation of certainty in existence. The realization that one cannot coherently doubt the existence of everything, for the act of doubt itself presupposes an existent doubter. In the persistent present, we'll see that only the present moment truly exists in time. The past and future are not independent entities, only records and anticipations in the present. Now, in the illusion of nothingness, we have closed the remaining escape hatch for non-being. There is no timeless void, no alternate reality of nothing that ever was or ever will be. Existence is all there is. It is continuous, unbroken, and ever-present. Even what we call empty time or empty space is filled with the fact of being, if not material being, then the being of fields, laws, or at least the being of logic and truth. By dismantling the notion of nothingness, we also dismantle certain existential fears and confusions. We need not worry about some oblivion outside of reality that might overtake us, because no such oblivion exists. Death is not a transition into nothingness. It is simply the end of the process of an individual life. The atoms and energy that constituted you remain in existence, and the information that was you ceases to be organized in a conscious form. There is no realm of nothingness that swallows you. There is only the continuation of existence in other forms, minus the form that was you. Likewise, in cosmology, we can be assured that questions of ultimate origins must seek something, a cause, a prior state, a fundamental law, rather than appealing to an impossible null. And in our philosophy, we can confidently assert that reality has no opposite. Being is a tautology unto itself. It is because it is. To say nothing is real is truly a contradiction in terms. At this point, we can retire the phantom of nothingness. The door is definitively closed on the idea that nothing could have been the case or could ever be achieved. Every road we travel in reasoning, we find existence at the start, middle, and end. As St. Augustine advised, we started in the middle, where we find ourselves in an existent world, and we see that there was no beginning in nothing, and no end in nothing. Augustine of Hippo ND. Existence is victorious by default. It admits no alternative. This realization is a cornerstone of existential logicism. It tells us that any philosophy or worldview must work within the fact of being. We cannot appeal to nothingness for salvation, fear, or explanation. We are faced with the positive reality of something at all times, and that is a liberating truth. Having banished the illusion of nothingness, we reinforce our foundation, the universe we study, the life we live, the thoughts we think. All of it exists in the domain of being and cannot slip into non-being. In the chapters that follow, we will build on this secure ontological footing. We have a world of something to explore, and no phantoms of nothingness will distract us from understanding the nature of that something. The path ahead lies in examining the various modes and structures of existence, now that we know existence is the only game in town. The void has been vanquished. What remains is to understand the plenitude of being with clarity and logic. In the end, nothingness was much ado about nothing. And now we can move on, firmly rooted in what is. Now that we've dismantled the illusion of nothingness, it's time to confront a closely related impossibility, infinite regress, and make way for a persistent present. 3.9% formal derivation for ion, the illusion of nothingness. This appendix states the ion pillar in formal terms. The guiding claim is that absolute nothingness is not a coherent metaphysical option at all. Any intelligible use of nothing is either 1. A local absence within a wider background of reality, or 2. An abstract marker, 0, empty set, null, defined inside some already existing structure. In both cases, nothing is ontologically parasitic. It only makes sense against a backdrop of being. Once this is made explicit, we obtain the inescapability of existence. There is no admissible way. Reality could have been such that literally nothing exists. 1. Occurrences and worlds. Ion is about existence as such, not about consciousness. To keep things neutral, we work with a minimal notion of occurrence. Definition 3.1. Occurrence. Let R denote reality in the broadest sense, whatever there is. We introduce a unary predicate OCC, X. OCC X is read as X is an occurrence, some element, event, state, or item of reality. No assumptions about consciousness, cognition, or physicality are built in. An occurrence is simply whatever must obtain for reality to count as non-empty, in any sense at all. To talk about ways reality could be, we use a standard worlds as structures device. Definition 3.2. World. Reality candidate. A world or reality candidate is a structure. W equal to DW, IW, where DW is a domain, a set of items, and IW is an interpretation assigning truth conditions to predicates and relations, including OCC. We write world, W, for W is an admissible candidate for how reality might be, and we use OCCW, X, as shorthand for OCC. X holds in W under IW. For the purpose of ion, we do not initially assume that DW is non-empty. The point of the argument is precisely to show that empty domain realities cannot function as genuine reality candidates once we take the concept of nothingness seriously. 2. 3 uses of nothing. In the main text, we distinguished 3 kinds of nothing. 1. Local nothing. There's nothing in the box. 2. Abstract nothing, zeros, empty sets, null pointers. 3. Absolute nothing, no reality at all. We now register these schematically. Definition 3.3. Local nothingness. A local nothingness claim in a world W is a statement of the form, there is nothing with property P in region R. Formally, XXRPX. Here BW is some background structure in W, for example, a spacetime manifold or container, and RBW is a distinguished subregion. When convenient, we write. Local nothing U RP for this situation. Definition 3.4. Abstract nothingness. Let T be a formal or computational system with domain dt. An element nt dt is an abstract nothing for T if 1. dt equal to and 2. T designates nt as a special empty or null object, for example the empty set, the number 0 as additive identity, or a null pointer. We write abstract nothing T, nt, for this role. Definition 3.5. Absolute nothingness. By absolute nothingness, we mean what is typically intended when people ask why is there something, rather than nothing. Intuitively, absolute nothingness is a state in which there is no domain of objects, no occurrences, no space or time, no laws, no mathematical structures, no God, no observers, strictly no reality at all. If absolute nothingness were representable as a world, it would correspond to a reality candidate W0 such that dW0 equal to, and there is no background structure in which W0 itself exists as an object. We use the schematic sentence, N0, XOCCX, to stand for the content, nothing at all exists. Ion targets this N0 and denies that it can be realized by any world. W. 3. Local and abstract nothing as ontologically parasitic. We now make precise that local and abstract forms of nothing only make sense against a backdrop of occurrences. They're ontologically parasitic. Lemma 3.1. Local nothingness presupposes occurrences. In any world W, if local nothing U, RP, holds for some region R and property P, then W is not a world of absolute nothingness. In particular, local nothing U, RP XOCCW, X proof. If local nothing U, RP holds, then in W there exist a background structure, BW, a distinguished subregion, RBW, a property P and the state of affairs that R is P empty. At least these items are candidates for occurrences. Thus there exists some X such that OCW, X, and W is not empty in the sense of absolute nothingness. Lemma 3.2. Abstract nothingness presupposes a framework. If abstract nothing T, NT, for some theory T, then there exists at least one occurrence. Abstract nothing T, NT, XOCC, X, abstract nothing T, NT, entails that T has a non-empty domain dt, NT dt, and T is implemented or realized somewhere. As ink on paper, brain states, machine code, or as an abstract structure. In each case, the implementation of T is an occurrence in reality. So there exists at least one X with OCCX. Together, lemmas 3.1 and 3.2 capture the ontologically parasitic character of the familiar, coherent uses of nothing, N1 and N2. They are always nothing of type T within some background of being, never nothing, full stop. 4. Representation and host framework dependence. Absolute nothingness. N3 is usually gestured at via representations, sentences, models, pictures, or simulations that invite us to imagine literally nothing. The key point is that these representations themselves cannot live in a truly empty reality. Definition 3.6. Representation. A representation of a putative state S is any structure rep, S, that encodes S in a way that can be identified and distinguished from other structures, for example, a sentence, a mental image, a formal model, or a computer simulation. Whenever rep S exists in reality, we treat it as an occurrence. Lemma 3.3. Host framework dependence. For any state S, if a representation rep S exists, then there exists at least one occurrence. Rep S, X, OCC, X. In particular, this holds when S is absolute nothingness. Proof. If rep S exists at all, then rep S itself is an item in reality, a sentence, a pattern of neural firing, a data structure, or an abstract object. We can take rep S, or the process generating it, as a witness X such that OCC X. Thus, even if S is intended to describe absolute nothingness, the very existence of rep S ensures that in the reality where rep S lives, there is at least one occurrence. Absolute nothingness, therefore, cannot be the whole story in any reality where it is even thinkable, sayable, or modelable. Lemma 3.3 is the formal version of the core ion move. Every intelligible appearance of nothing is hosted inside a reality that already is not nothing. Absolute nothingness is ontologically parasitic on the very being it tries to deny. 5. The inescapability of existence. We can now state and prove the main result. No admissible world is literally empty. Theorem 3.4. INI. Inescapability of existence. For every admissible world, W, X, OCCW, X, equivalently, W. In modal shorthand, XOCC, X, it is necessary that something exists. There is no coherent reality in which literally nothing obtains. Proof. Suppose for contradiction that there is a world 0 such that world W0 and X. OCCW0 X. Intuitively, W0 is supposed to represent absolute nothingness. Now consider our use of W0 as a purported reality candidate. In the actual reality in which we reason, we are referring to W0, treating it as one option among others, our world versus the empty world, W0, and thus employing some representation rep, W0, of it. By lemma 3.3, the existence of rep, W0, entails X, OCC, X in the host reality. For W0 to count as an admissible reality candidate at all, it must inherit the minimal conditions that make talk of worlds meaningful. In particular, it must be part of a framework in which occurrences are possible and actual. In that framework, W0 cannot represent a total absence of occurrences. At best, it represents a local or abstract nothingness inside a larger, non-empty structure. Thus, W0 fails to qualify as a genuine world, matching the content N0. No world, W, can satisfy X, OCCW, X, hence, our assumption leads to contradiction. And we conclude, W world, W, X, OCCW, X, which is the inescapability of existence. 6. Corollaries and remarks. Corollary 3.7, minimal necessary realism. From theorem 3.4% we obtain X, OCC, X. Existence is not a contingent cosmic accident, it is built in. There is necessarily at least one occurrence. EL does not assume this as a brute axiom. It derives it by showing that attempts to deny it collapse into self-defeat or pseudo-description. Corollary 3.8. Dissolution of why something rather than nothing. The classical question, why is there something rather than nothing, presupposes that nothing, in the absolute sense, is an admissible world, a genuine rival to being. By theorem 3.4, there is no such world, W world, WX or CCW, X. Thus the contrast something versus nothing is ill-posed at the deepest level. Absolute nothingness is a pseudo-option generated by extending local and abstract absences beyond where they make sense. A better question, and the one EL goes on to address, is why this something rather than some other something? Given that being is inescapable, the live problem concerns the specific structure and laws of reality, not the supposed alternative of total non-being. Remark 3.9. Relation to classical anti-non-being moves. Parmenides and later thinkers insisted that what is not cannot be thought or spoken, and that being and thinking are intimately linked. Ion vindicates the core of that insight at the level of absolute nothingness, There is no admissible world of total non-being. However, EL does not follow Parmenides into denying change or plurality. We allow local absences, birth and death of structures, negation and difference. We only deny that these can be totalized into a coherent world of nothing. Being is inescapable, but it can be structured, changing, and diverse. Remark 3.1, Relation to ERP. The inescapability of existence is a metaphysical constraint. XOCC-X, asserting that every admissible reality must contain occurrences. The ERP pillar developed earlier is an epistemic reflexive sharpening of this. From any position inside reality that can form claims, there is a specific tokened occurrence, the claim itself as a state, that witnesses existence. ERP blocks denial of occurrence from within. Ion thus blocks nothingness as a global alternative, while ERP blocks skepticism about existence from any internal viewpoint. Together they form L's base against both metaphysical nihilism and radical skepticism. Remark 3.1-1, not mere semantics. It might be objected that ruling out an empty world is merely a matter of logical convention, for example, the standard requirement that first-order domains are non-empty. Ion goes deeper. We did not start by stipulating by definition. No world has an empty domain. Instead, we, 1. Took the strongest reading of absolute nothingness as a candidate world. 2. Examined what is required to even specify or represent that candidate. And 3. Found that those very requirements presuppose occurrences. The so-called empty world turns out never to be empty at the level that matters. It is either a local or abstract nothingness inside a richer setting, or an incoherent non-world that cannot stand alongside genuine reality candidates at all. Excluding absolute nothingness is therefore not a syntactic convention. It is a metaphysical consequence of taking seriously what nothing would have to mean. Remark 3.1-2. Existence is necessary. Form is open. The inescapability of existence fixes one fact with maximal strength. XOCC-X. What it does not fix is which particular structures, laws, or constants exist. EL remains open on whether the actual laws are necessary or contingent, and on which alternative somethings could have obtained. However, Ion constrains the metaphysical space. No option that collapses reality into literal nothingness is admissible. Any neighboring reality, different constants, different laws, still has to host occurrences. This is the bridge to the later problem of constants in L. The deep question is never why something rather than nothing, but why these structural choices rather than others, given that something was unavoidable. Chapter 4. The logical elimination